Hi everyone. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Card. Professor Card received the 2021 Nobel Prize in Economics for his empirical contributions to the field of labor economics. He is the class of 1950 professor of economics at UC Berkeley and the director of the Center for Labor Economics and the Econometric Lab. He was president of the American Economic Association in 2021, and in 1995 he received the John Bates Clark Medal, which is awarded to the economist under 40 whose work has made the most significant contribution to the field. From 2012 to 2017, he was also the director of the Labor Studies program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Now it is my honor to welcome our guest, Professor Card, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zunian. Are you going to ask me some questions, or how are we going to proceed?
I think we could talk about some of your research that you've done, and I also have a few questions here, and I'd like to open it up to the audience if like anyone else has any questions. So okay, so let's start off with the audience. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, all right. So I have one. So with growing concerns over the expanding gap between the wages of managers and that of the average worker, what efforts do you think will be the most effective at closing this gap?
I'm not entirely sure that there's any obvious things that can be done, to tell you the truth. The wages are set by employers, sort of taking account of what would happen if they set a higher wage or a lower wage, turnover, who they want to hire, and so on. And in the U.S. economy, we don't really intervene very much in that process. So there's not really any mechanisms to really do anything about that. It's basically a market-based system. People do talk about having various kinds of income support for people that are earning relatively low wages. For instance, in the United States right now, if you have children and you have a job and your income is below, around $30,000, you get some extra subsidy from the government called the Earned Income Tax Credit. And lower income people get some other kinds of breaks that are meant to help increase their purchasing power. For example, in some states, if slots are available, it's possible for a lower income family to get their child into a subsidized daycare system. We don't do very well with that. There's not very many slots available relative to most other countries, but that would be an example of something you could do to try and help the purchasing power of lower wage people.
Thank you. And then the second question is, the unemployment rate in the US is currently roughly the same as it was pre-pandemic. However, many people would argue that Main Street or the broader economy has not yet fully recovered. Do you see a dichotomy in this space? And if so, how do you reconcile these two realities?
Well, I think in many ways, the economy is doing pretty well. In fact, there's pretty strong evidence that in some ways the economy is a little overheated. And so concern about that is leading the Federal Reserve to increase interest rates. I think most economists and most analysts believe they're going to continue down that pathway, actually trying to reduce growth in the economy. Basically create, if not a recession, at least a kind of a slowdown in the rate of growth. I think a lot of economists, certainly I'm one, who thinks that probably we're going to have a recession. So although the economy seems to be quite good right now, I don't think it's going to be nearly as good next year myself.
Yu Chen has a question in the chat. He says, I'm really interested in studying econ in college. What exactly would I learn if I major in econ? For example, microeconomic or macroeconomic?
Right. Well, it's sort of uh, normally in most programs you would take a few basic courses. You would take a basic course in microeconomics, a basic course in macroeconomics, and a basic course in what we call econometrics, which is kind of statistics for economists and data analysis. These days at Berkeley, at least, most of the economics majors are going into jobs related to the tech sector. And for them, the most important parts are the data analysis and microeconomics part. There are some positions for undergraduates who do macro, but that's much less so. There's a lot of openings for people who graduate in economics but have a strong data science, or even joint major in data economics and computer science, or economics and data science, or economics and statistics. I think that's where there's a lot of interest right now, and certainly a lot of tech companies are trying to hire people like that.
Thank you. And then also, what would you see as the best way to address the issue of people not returning to work? Because that's been something that's been covered pretty extensively in the news.
Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of reasons why people aren't returning to work. One I alluded to earlier was daycare problems. So the fraction of women who are working in the United States is actually quite a bit below the fraction working in lots of other countries, Canada, most of Europe. And a lot of people think that's because of two things, really. US is a fairly low wage economy for many workers. So there's a lot of people, highly paid people earn a lot in the United States, but very low wage people don't earn much. So there's a lot of people who don't earn very much and also have kids. And so those people have a very difficult conundrum because they can go to work, but it doesn't really pay very well when you factor in the cost of daycare. And so that's a choice that we have made, not to have broadly government provided daycare slots. You could think that that might help a little bit, and that certainly would be part of the explanation for why U.S. is lagging behind a lot of other countries in the fraction of women who work. Historically, the U.S. was kind of at the lead in many kind of more modern social trends, like fraction of women who worked, education, fraction of people who went to university. But in the last 30 years, it's kind of fallen behind. And in most sort of benchmarks, the U.S. is now drifting pretty badly relative to the kind of leading countries in terms of many of those outcomes, like fraction of women who work, or fraction of kids who go to university, complete a degree, and so on. So this is kind of becoming a more middle income country in some ways.
Thank you. So actually on this topic, do you think universal daycare would be something that the US should implement? And then, so if that's the case, how important would that be to narrowing the gender pay gap?
Uh, I don't know whether they should. I mean, they're not going to. It's definitely not going to happen. Um, there's no support. The country is fairly conservative, and looks like we're going to have a conservative majority going forward for quite a long time. And so there's no real support for that. Most of the countries that have a fairly generous program of providing daycare have had better success in getting a larger fraction of women in work.
Thank you. And then also, there's been a kind of a lot of discussion about the different formats of work, so like in person, remote, and hybrid. So in the near future, what kind of format do you see as likely to win out, and what implications do you think that would have for the broader like economy?
I think that's a good question. There's a kind of a difficult question because no one is 100% sure what the benefits are of getting people to go to work rather than work at home. A lot of employers think that their workforce is going to be more innovative and more productive if they're at work at least 3 or 4 days a week. Um, and so I think there's going to be increasing pressure for people to have some time in the work at home, or excuse me, at going to work, or showing up at the office. But right now, especially in my area, like Northern California, fairly large number of employers aren't requiring people to go back to work too much. For instance, the university doesn't require most of the staff to go back to work. Most of the staff works from home most of the days. Um, and I do some consulting in the tech sector. Most of the tech companies are only requiring, and not really requiring people to go back to work. But I did it. It's been unsuccessful, and they're actively trying to recruit people. And so people say, "Well, I don't want to go to work. I want to work at home and maybe go to work 1 day a week or 2 days a week or something." So I think there's going to be some forces there. Now, if we get into a recessionary environment where jobs are less plentiful, I think employers will have more say, and so I think we'll see more people going back to work. Also, people will become more nervous about losing their job. And one of the things they'll do to try and make sure that they keep their job is to show up at work and make sure the boss knows that they're working. There's some evidence that that kind of behavior goes on in the labor market.
Thank you. And just going back to a previous point you mentioned about a likely future recession for the near future. Oh, sorry. Wait, actually, Jonathan has a question. You can go first, Jonathan.
Hi. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure, thanks.
Okay, so I'm not like I don't have that big of a background in economics, but it was just kind of surprising when you said earlier that the economy was doing well, because I'd heard like there's just a lot of inflation going on, and like the Biden administration is like they're blamed heavily, like their what is it, approval ratings are super low, and I think a big reason is inflation and gas. So like how did this really like happen? And like I know you talked about the recession, like starting a recession, cutting interest rates, and like do you think those are like the best ways to address this problem?
Well, starting with what's the causes of the current inflation, there's really
Uh-huh.
sort of several causes. One is that there's a lot of demand, so that people have a lot of income and they want to buy stuff. For instance, if you take an air flight recently, you'll notice the planes are packed, the airports are packed. There's been a lot of cancellations. They can't, so there's can't keep up with demand. So there's a lot of evidence that consumers have a lot of income and want to spend it, and that's normally one of the main reasons why the economy overheats is that there's too much demand, and as a result, there gets to be some inflation. And we haven't had that. We had a couple of episodes like that in the last 20 years. We had an episode like that in the late 1990s during last year's President Clinton's reign, and there was some inflation. It didn't get up to the level we have now. And there was a bit of a boom in 2003, 2004, 2005, some inflation, but nothing like what we have now. So that's one part. Another part is as a result of COVID, there were a lot of interruptions to sources of supply. This is when people say supply chain, what they mean is that there's a lot of products that are, for various reasons, not easily available. For instance, computer chips. There seems to be kind of a shortage of computer chips, partially because demand has come back for all kinds of products, like people are getting refrigerators with computer chips, and all cars have many, many computer chips in them. So as a result of that, the automobile companies are not able to produce as many cars. And so not as many cars are being sold. And so people go to the dealer lot and look at cars, and there's relatively few available. The dealer doesn't give you a good deal. The dealer basically marks up the price to the full retail price, the full list price. So that's another source of inflation. And the third source, obviously, is the war in Ukraine, which put a huge shock into the oil price market. You could argue that none of these things have much to do with federal government policy. They're kind of, because, and you can kind of see that that must be sort of true because all the other countries are having the same problems. So you have the same problems in Germany, you have the same problems in all of Europe, you have the same problems in Canada, um, Australia, Japan, everywhere has kind of got a lot of these same problems. So I think, though, that because of this concern about inflation that the Federal Reserve has, that they're going to, they believe the economy is overheating. So with the economy overheating, that's as good as it gets in terms of jobs. And there's a lot of evidence that the job market is really good right now. So there's a measure of how many firms are looking for workers. That's called a vacancy, when you have a slot open for a worker. And there's a survey of vacancies. And there's another survey of how many workers are looking for work. Those are the unemployed. And the ratio of the number of vacancies to the number of unemployed is a measure, standard measure that economists use to say how good is the labor market. So if the labor market is good, then there's relatively more vacancies and not so many unemployed. And right now, the ratio of vacancies to unemployed is off the charts. It's higher than it's ever been. So it's a very, very good time to look for a job. But a lot of people think that's going to change very quickly. And you're already seeing some signs of changes. For instance, the housing market is really cooling down quickly.
Thank you so much for the great answer. So, speaking of changes and looking forward to the future, so you mentioned earlier the likelihood for a future recession. So, in the case of that recession, what do you think policymakers can do now to kind of prepare for that recession? And then, if it does happen, what do you think the Fed should do, like apart from lowering interest rates, which it actually might not be able to do to a significant extent with the currently low rates? So, yeah, sorry.
Well, they're raising interest rates. They're going to keep raising them. They might raise them as high as 4 or 5%, which isn't that high if the inflation rate is 8%. Because if you think about it, if you put $1 in the bank and wait a year, and you get 5% inflation, then you get back $1.05. But if inflation is 8%, then you're still behind 3 cents because everything's gone up. What used to cost $1 costs $1.08, and you only get $1.05 back in interest. So if the interest rate is below the inflation rate, money in the bank is losing value. And that's not normally a situation that can sustain itself. That's a situation where what economists say is the real interest rate, so the interest rate after inflation, is negative. And so that's not likely going to stay permanent. So either inflation is going to come down or interest rates are going to go up. And I think probably both of those things are going to happen. So I think we're going to have pretty high interest rates by Christmas, and then the economy is going to slow down quite a bit. And then the Federal Reserve at that point, if they see inflation tapering off, then they might start reducing interest rates. The federal government doesn't really have many things it can do. I mean, basically right now, the federal government is kind of hogtied. They're not doing anything much. They are running huge deficits because they cut corporate income taxes and they cut individual income taxes during the Trump era. And they cut the taxes so much that there's much lower tax revenue relative to what they're spending. And I suspect what will happen is if Republicans take charge of the House and the Senate in the next term, which everyone thinks they will, they're going to be proposing to cut how much the government spends in a variety of different ways. That will be somewhat deflationary too. That will reduce demand. But right now, the federal government is running huge deficits.
Thank you so much. You mentioned briefly about if we raise interest rates, then the economy might go into a slowdown. Do you see any parallels between the current situation and the stagflation era and the actions of Paul Volcker, if there might be any parallels to be drawn there?
Well, it's important to know about that era because among central bankers, Paul Volcker is kind of the king. He's like the great hero. And for many years prior to Paul Volcker's time, there was, inflation episodes, and the Fed did various things, but they didn't pursue such an aggressive agenda of getting inflation down really, really low at all costs. And so Volcker came in, and the unemployment rate went to almost 10% for a number of years, 1982 and 83. It was a very serious recession. It was considered the worst recession since the Great Depression at the time. I remember it well because that's when I graduated from finishing my PhD, and I was trying to get a job. And the job market wasn't very good. And a lot of different things happen when you have, when you have those high interest rates and the economy really tanking. But so central bankers believe that it's really important to have this inflation under control, and to have everyone in the economy believe that no matter what happens, they will fight inflation. That's what they call credibility. You sometimes hear them talk about credibility of the central bank. And so I think you're going to see Jerome Powell and others they're kind of backed into a corner. They have to fight inflation very strongly because that's what everybody thinks they should do. I'm not sure what they should do. Macroeconomics is not really my area of expertise. And people like me who study microeconomics usually find macro kind of puzzling. So I don't really, don't have a strong view on it, but I'm pretty sure based on what you can read and see, you can see that this is going to happen.
Thank you. So Siang actually has a question. He asks, do you believe that the Fed will truly engineer a quote unquote soft landing for the current economic decline? And how likely do you think the risk for stagflation is?
Well, as I just said, I'm not really a macroeconomist. So I don't really know. I'm somewhat skeptical that they will succeed. I think you can read the same as I can various people talking about it, and it's not like the really only tool they have is raise interest rates, and they can keep raising interest rates. Raising interest rates doesn't have an automatic effect on things. It kind of slows things down kind of slowly. And then once things start to slow down, they might all of a sudden start slowing down really quickly. And then if you lower interest rates, it doesn't necessarily respond quickly. So it's kind of like driving a car with the steering wheel only loosely connected. So, or maybe better example, the brakes and the accelerator are not really working too well. So you can kind of put on the brakes and you can kind of put on the accelerator, but it doesn't really respond very well. And so I think that's the question that a lot of people have. I don't really know myself.
Thank you. Just to be mindful of the time limit, we only have time for a few questions left. So what do you think the minimum wage should be and why? And also, what are the impacts of this change on the broader economy?
Well, I think that there isn't really an easy answer to what the minimum wage should be, and that's not really ever been my. I don't usually go around telling people what they should do. If you raise the minimum wage, workers get higher income, firms have higher costs. They pass some of those costs on to consumers. Some of them are passed on in very indirect ways. So, for instance, if you raise the wages of all the workers at the mall, then the mall earns less money too, and they basically have lower rents. Or if you raise wages, then next year, when somebody wants to rent agricultural land for labor-intensive crops like strawberries or something, they say, "Well, I can't afford to pay quite as high rents." So the costs of higher wages get passed through into various parts of the economy, and some people feel like that's not worth it. That you really shouldn't do that. Other people feel like you need some tool to raise wages of lower wage people, and so it's kind of that's kind of a value question, what the minimum wage should be. There's quite a bit of research. I did some research on this many years ago, back in the 1990s. Even into the 80s, looking at what happens when you raise minimum wage, how many jobs are lost. When the minimum wage is quite low, which the federal minimum wage is right now in the United States, you wouldn't think raising that wage very much would have a huge effect. But if the minimum wage gets into higher and higher levels, then most people think eventually it'll cause some losses of employment. Again, some people feel like any loss of employment is too much. Other people feel like, well, any policy we adopt has got some cost. So if we raise wages, most workers get a wage increase, and then some people have to turn over and look for other jobs, and there's more job rotation going on. It's really a value question. But again, I don't, the states are going to raise their minimum wages. In fact, some just did. Some states have got kind of automatic policies of raising their minimum wage. But the federal minimum wage is not going to get raised.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, this is definitely very relevant to the current news. And then also kind of one thing to look for in the future is how do you foresee the role of automation playing out in wage inequality? And do you think a robot dominated future would have to be accompanied by a UBI, which is often talked about?
Um, well, some people think that. Um, we've had in the past many episodes of vast changes in the way that things are done. A really good example is around just before World War I in 1900. A huge fraction of Americans lived on farms, and there was a lot of manual labor on farms, and huge numbers of workers were employed, doing farm labor. And then between 1920 and 1940, there was really a massive mechanization, and the fraction of people working on farms fell enormously. So lots of those people that used to work on farms lost their farm jobs and had to do something else. The economy survived, and we didn't introduce a universal basic income, and some of those people switched to other sectors. A lot of them went to jobs in the city. Some of them, presumably some of the oldest ones, kind of retired and maybe didn't have such a great time of it. And so I think based on past experience with episodes of technological change, the same thing happened when they introduced the steam engines in a lot of automation in plants. All through the Industrial Revolution, there's been discussions of this kind of problem. And in the past, it's always been the case that people eventually find something else to do. For instance, right now, there's lots of jobs, right? Including jobs for pretty low wage people doing jobs that you say, well, these are kind of, not that great of jobs. Why don't we automate those jobs? But it's pretty hard to automate jobs and somewhat expensive. And if you're not paying very much for workers, doesn't necessarily mean you should automate the jobs. And there's a lot of jobs that are inherently very, very difficult to automate. So I suspect there will be some pressure on certain kinds of jobs, as there was when we introduced, in the era of the 1980s and 1990s, when the internet and modern technologies and IT started to be developed. But I'm not sure that the robotization is such a huge difference from earlier episodes. Some people do. I mean, part of it is there's a group of people in sort of philosophical people who are very libertarian, don't really like government, and also have kind of, I would say, relative disdain for low-income people. And so they say low-income people are kind of a drain on our economy, and they cause us to waste money raising taxes for all kinds of purposes, and they mess up everything. So why don't we just buy them off, give them a UBT, and then they can just go and smoke weed and listen to rock music or whatever. And so that's sort of a libertarian dream, I think. And some of the people supporting this are those kind of extreme libertarians who basically have a lot of disdain for lower income people. I'm not really in that category myself, so I think that lots of lower income people can contribute to the economy and have things that they are adding, and their children will do okay. But there's another group that has this very negative view about people without a PhD or without a high level of education, and that tends to be the group that you're talking about.
Thank you. So I think we can end on the question, what advice would you give to a high school student who is interested in studying such pressing labor economics topics such as wage inequality and the gender pay gap, for example?
Study all the math you can. The most important thing in economics, getting into a PhD program or even succeeding in a really good program, most important thing is math. It's advanced, economics is kind of like applied advanced calculus, a lot of it. And statistics is a lot of advanced, everyone needs to know a lot of statistics these days because we're just drowning in data. And that's, again, very math intensive. And so everybody really needs to study as much math as they can.
Thank you so much. 100% agree. So with less than a minute left, I just want to say this was a great discussion. Thank you so very much, Professor Card, for coming on. We covered so many diverse topics such as minimum wage, inflation, gender-related economic issues, and policy. And just thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for your time, Professor Card.